He was born in silence and learned early that language could be a weapon. Nikolai Ivanovich Kuznetsov came into the world in 1911 in a small village near Perm, deep in the forests of the Urals. His childhood was ordinary by the standards of that harsh land. Snowbound winters, labour in the fields, the sound of axes splitting pine. His father, a farmer, believed in education, but books were rare and teachers scarcer. So Nikolai taught himself, first Russian grammar, then German, using torn newspapers and railway manuals left behind by travellers. No one understood where the gift came from. By 15 he could speak German so fluently that even native speakers could not detect the difference. He mimicked dialects, gestures and tones with unsettling precision. Words fascinated him, not for their meaning, but for their power to shape perception. Language, he would later write, is a uniform you can put on. After school, he worked as a draftsman and clerk in the lumber industry. It was a humble job, but it gave him access to foreign engineers and traders. He listened, observed, and practiced their idioms until he could slip into their identities with ease. Co-workers joked that he was half German already. That talent did not go unnoticed. In the 1930s, Soviet intelligence quietly began searching for men who could pass among foreigners without suspicion. Someone in the regional NKVD sent his name to Moscow. His first recruitment interview was brief. They asked about his family, his work, his loyalties. Then, in German, they asked him to describe his hometown. He did, fluently, vividly, even adding jokes in Bavarian dialect. The officer smiled and said only, "You will be useful." From that day, his life began to split in two. He started with small assignments, translating intercepted communications, posing as a visiting technician to gather information from foreign engineers. But the work appealed to something deeper in him, the thrill of deception, the satisfaction of precision. Each successful mission erased a little more of the line between Nikolai Kuznetsov the man and the character he portrayed. In 1938, when Stalin's purges tore through the NKVD, he was briefly dismissed. Too talented, too odd, too difficult to control. He returned home, restless, working again in civilian offices. Yet even there, he continued to train himself in secrecy, practicing new signatures, studying documents, altering his handwriting, reading German novels aloud until the accent felt natural. Those who met him in this period found him quiet, courteous, distant, a man whose mind seemed elsewhere. Then came June 1941. The German invasion changed everything. Overnight, his peculiar skills became a weapon of war. The NKVD reactivated him, this time for missions far more dangerous. He was to join a newly formed partisan intelligence group operating behind enemy lines. His assignment was unprecedented: to live as a German officer, infiltrate Nazi command networks, and bring back information that could shift the course of battles. The legend they built for him was meticulous. Name: Paul Wilhelm Siebert. Rank: Oberleutnant in the Wehrmacht. Background: civil engineer from Breslau, wounded in the early stages of the war and reassigned to administrative service in the East. His documents were perfect, stamped, aged, complete with leave records and signatures from fictional superiors. His uniform fit flawlessly. For weeks he practiced his new identity, the gait, the posture, the small habits of German officers. He stopped responding to Russian entirely. The transformation was not performance. It was absorption. When he looked in the mirror, the face staring back was no longer Nikolai Kuznetsov. By the autumn of 1942, he crossed the front lines with forged orders and a new past. He walked into occupied Rovno, heart steady, speaking fluent German, nodding to checkpoints as if born to the uniform. The guards saluted him. He saluted back. In that moment, the double life became real. Every word he spoke, every smile he offered could mean survival or death. But for Nikolai Kuznetsov, it was more than duty. It was a test of identity itself. He had spent his youth mastering language. Now he would use it to dismantle an empire from inside its own walls. He entered occupied Ukraine not as a spy, but as a German officer named Paul Siebert. In the autumn of 1942, as snow began to fall over western Ukraine, a tall man in a Wehrmacht uniform stepped from a military truck onto the cobbled streets of Rovno. The town was the administrative centre of German-occupied Ukraine, full of officers, officials, and collaborators. The man saluted sharply, handed over his travel papers, and walked toward the commandant's headquarters. The guards read the name on the documents, Paul Wilhelm Siebert. They waved him through. No one knew that the officer was not German at all. Beneath the uniform, the mannerisms, and the clipped accent was a Soviet agent, Nikolai Kuznetsov, operating under the deepest cover the NKVD had ever attempted. His mission was simple in wording and almost impossible in practice. Infiltrate the occupation administration, collect intelligence, and strike when opportunities appeared. He was to live among his enemies, dine with them, share their jokes, and kill them when ordered. For months, every breath he took was an act of deception. The details of his legend were flawless. He carried papers showing service in the engineering corps, complete with a minor wound sustained on the Eastern Front. He wore a watch engraved with a German inscription, a small prop that completed the illusion. To those around him, he was not a foreigner. He was a comrade in arms, another weary officer doing his duty for the Reich. Rovno was a dangerous place for such a game. It was crawling with the Gestapo, with informants and secret police. The city had witnessed massacres of Jews and executions of partisans. Fear was its language. Yet it was also a place where information flowed, where officers drank, boasted, and made mistakes. And that was where Siebert excelled. Kuznetsov's charm was subtle, professional. He spoke with an officer's courtesy, never too friendly, never too distant. In cafes and officers' clubs, he listened to complaints about supply shortages, about orders from Berlin, about new fortifications in the east. Every name, every route, every careless remark became a thread he memorized. At night, he wrote reports in code, passing them through underground couriers to partisan commanders. Within weeks, Paul Siebert became a familiar figure in Rovno society. He attended receptions, met with German engineers, even befriended officials from the occupation administration. His fluency and calm convinced everyone that he belonged. He was too perfect to be questioned, one surviving witness later said. The first months were the hardest. Each morning, he woke in a German billet, surrounded by men who would shoot him on sight if they knew who he was. He shaved, adjusted his collar, and practiced the same phrase in front of the mirror. Guten Morgen, meine Herren. Good morning, gentlemen. The voice he heard no longer sounded like his own. Through his cover began to pass critical intelligence, the locations of airfields, troop transfers, and supply lines. One report included information about secret planning meetings for Operation Citadel, the German offensive near Kursk. It reached Moscow weeks before the battle began, but gathering data was only half his work. His orders also included liquidation of key Nazi officials responsible for atrocities. For this, he built a small network of partisans and couriers. Together, they executed swift, surgical attacks. Assassinations carried out in daylight, followed by quick disappearances into the crowd. Each operation was signed with the invisible hand of Paul Siebert, the officer who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere. The Gestapo grew suspicious, but they were chasing shadows. Reports described a mysterious German who appeared moments before assassinations, speaking perfect military German, then vanished. Their sketches even resembled him, but who would dare accuse a fellow officer of being a Soviet agent? Despite his composure, the strain on Kuznetsov grew unbearable. He lived two lives, two voices, two consciences. When he passed mirrors, he sometimes paused, startled by the man in the reflection. He wrote once in a hidden note, "The mask no longer comes off." In early 1943, he took greater risks, expanding his circle into Lviv and Ternopil. There, he penetrated deeper into German command circles, even attending meetings where officers discussed plans for anti-partisan operations and the deportation of civilians. He memorized names and dates with photographic precision. But every success came with a shadow. After one assassination, a brutal execution of a Gestapo officer responsible for mass shootings, his superiors in Moscow congratulated him. Yet Kuznetsov felt nothing. He had become, in his own mind, an instrument, not a man. You stop feeling when you must become what you hunt, he later said to a fellow agent. The occupation was entering its deadliest phase. The Germans were growing desperate, the Gestapo more paranoid. One mistake, one misplaced word, could unravel the entire illusion. Still, Paul Siebert moved through Rovno's streets each morning with the same calm precision, nodding to sentries who saluted him respectfully. He had entered their world so completely that even he no longer knew where Nikolai ended and Siebert began. He was the perfect spy, and perfection in war is only ever temporary. He began not only to listen to Nazis, but to hunt them. By early 1943, Paul Siebert had become a ghost that walked freely through the heart of the German occupation. Officers trusted him, secretaries greeted him, and local collaborators whispered about him. He carried the authority of a real German officer, one with impeccable manners, sharp intelligence, and a past no one dared to question. But Kuznetsov's mission was no longer just to collect information. Moscow's orders had changed. The Germans were preparing new offensives, new massacres, new retaliations against civilians. His task now was to strike directly, to dismantle the machinery of terror one official at a time. The transformation from spy to assassin was quiet, almost invisible. He still attended meetings, still smiled at dinner tables, but behind that calm exterior was calculation. Each handshake became reconnaissance. Each drink shared with an officer could end in death. His first major target was the head of the Rovno District Court, a man personally responsible for ordering executions of hundreds of civilians. One afternoon, Siebert requested a private audience on judicial cooperation. The judge arrived on time, alone. Kuznetsov shot him twice in the chest with a small Walther pistol, placed a briefcase beside the body, and walked calmly out of the building. Witnesses later swore they had seen a German officer leave the scene. The killing sent shockwaves through the occupation administration. The Gestapo was furious. Posters appeared offering rewards for information about Soviet terrorists posing as German officers. Yet no one suspected that the killer was inside their own ranks. His operations grew bolder. In February 1943, he assassinated General von Ilgen, a senior Nazi official involved in anti-partisan operations. Later, he ambushed and killed Hans Gale, an SS officer notorious for his brutality. Each attack was precise, clinical, the work of a man who understood both languages of war, fear and silence. Between missions, Kuznetsov continued his intelligence work. He learned of secret troop movements toward the southern front, details of fuel shortages, and high-level plans concerning the Caucasus oil fields. He sent coded messages through couriers, reports that reached Moscow weeks before German counteroffensives began. But his most extraordinary discovery came later that year. During a reception in Lviv, disguised as a staff officer on inspection duty, he overheard fragments of a conversation between senior German diplomats. They spoke of a special operation planned against the Allied leaders in Tehran, a bold assassination attempt targeting Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin. Kuznetsov memorized every word, every name. Within days, his report was sent through partisan channels to Soviet intelligence, eventually reaching Moscow. The plan, codenamed Long Jump, was later confirmed by other sources, and prevented before it began. Some historians argue that his warning saved the lives of the Allied leaders and possibly shortened the war itself. By mid-1943, Paul Siebert was more than a spy. He was an idea, the invisible enemy inside the occupation. German officers began suspecting one another, searching for traitors that didn't exist. The Gestapo interrogated dozens of people. Kuznetsov watched it all with cold detachment, knowing that paranoia was now his greatest weapon. But the work was wearing him down. He had lived as Siebert for nearly 2 years. The role consumed him. His accent was flawless, his confidence absolute, yet in moments of solitude he sometimes caught himself thinking in German before Russian. He would stop, whisper his real name under his breath, and feel nothing. Even his comrades in the underground noticed the change. He was efficient, one partisan later said, but not human anymore. The boundary between man and mask had vanished. Still, he pressed on. Orders were orders, and his precision was unmatched. By late 1943, his name was whispered in both fear and reverence. To the Nazis, he was a phantom. To the Soviets, a legend in the making. But legends do not last long in war. Each new mission brought him closer to discovery. His face was becoming known, his mannerisms remembered. The Gestapo's net was tightening, and even perfection could not stay invisible forever. He had turned the enemy's confidence into his greatest weapon. But every disguise comes with an expiration date. The man who fooled the Reich was finally betrayed by chance. By the first months of 1944, the walls of his invented world were closing in. The Germans were losing the east. The front line was shifting westward in collapse and confusion. Each retreat brought new layers of paranoia. Every command post was on edge, every checkpoint armed with suspicion. The occupation machine he had infiltrated so perfectly was beginning to devour itself. For Nikolai Kuznetsov, or Paul Siebert, as he was still known in every official document, the situation grew impossible. He had lived for years under an identity that no longer had a place to hide. The city of Rovno was in flames, the Gestapo archives half destroyed, the loyal officers either dead or fleeing. It was time to disappear, to bring his mission to an end. His final orders were to move west with a small partisan escort and reach Soviet lines. The intelligence he carried, reports about German redeployments, the long-jump assassination plot, the movements of retreating SS divisions, could still save lives. He gathered his notes, burned his false papers, and kept only one set of forged documents, the credentials of Paul Siebert, Oberleutnant of the Wehrmacht. On the morning of February 9, 1944, they left Rovno before dawn. The air was sharp, the snow crusted with ice. They rode in stolen carts through the forests of Volhynia, avoiding roads. Every few kilometers, Kuznetsov checked the map by lantern light, memorizing the route in case they needed to split up. He said little. His face was pale, gaunt, expressionless, the face of a man who had worn too many masks. By nightfall, they reached the outskirts of a small village called Borodin. The partisans decided to rest in an abandoned hut, cold and half buried in snow. They were close, only a few dozen kilometers from the nearest Soviet positions. Kuznetsov was quiet, polishing his pistol by candlelight. One of the men later recalled that he whispered something to himself, perhaps in German. He looked, the partisan said, like someone already walking through another life. At dawn, the sound of boots broke the silence. A patrol, local Ukrainian auxiliaries working for the Germans, had spotted tracks leading toward the hut. The ambush came fast, shouted orders, rifles firing, bullets cutting through frost. The partisans scattered into the trees. Kuznetsov stayed behind, returning fire from the doorway. 2 shots dropped the first attackers, another grazed his arm. A grenade burst near the window, shattering glass and timber. Smoke and snow filled the room. When the shouting stopped, the forest was silent again. He never made it out. Some witnesses said he was hit by a grenade, others that he shot himself to avoid capture. A few locals claimed they saw the Germans dragging his body into the open field, laying it among 2 others, all dressed in Wehrmacht uniforms. The officers examined their papers and left, satisfied. They had killed another group of deserters. No one realized that the officer they buried had been the Soviet Union's most successful infiltrator. For months, his name vanished from reports. In Moscow, the NKVD waited for his next coded message, but none came. Only when Soviet troops retook Rovno later that year did partisans identify his remains, recognized by a gold tooth and a healed fracture in his wrist, an injury from his youth in Perm. Even then, confirmation came quietly, passed by courier, without ceremony. The Germans never discovered the truth. Their files described the encounter simply: 3 enemy agents disguised as German officers killed in firefight near Borodin. The Gestapo never realized that one of those men had dined in their mess halls, signed their documents, and killed their officials in daylight. For the NKVD, Kuznetsov's death was both a loss and a vindication. His intelligence had already shaped strategy in the region. His reports about German command structures and assassination plots had reached the highest circles of Soviet leadership. But they had paid the ultimate price for precision, the life of the man who had written them. There was no funeral, no grave marked with his name. The forest took him as it had so many others: partisans, villagers, soldiers, spies. His comrades said the snow covered him by morning, hiding the body of the man who had hidden himself for years. Yet his death was not an erasure. It was the closing of a circle. He had lived by deception, fought through deception, and died inside it. When the Red Army later liberated Volhynia, soldiers found an abandoned hut near Borodin. On its wall, carved faintly with a knife, were 3 words in German. Ich bin frei. I am free. No one could prove that Kuznetsov wrote them, but those who knew him believed it. It was the last disguise dropped, the last truth spoken in a war built on lies. He had fooled an empire, stolen its voice, and vanished into its silence. In the end, he escaped the only way left to him, by becoming untouchable, even to history itself. He vanished without a body, but his legend refused to die. In the spring of 1944, the forests of Volhynia were full of ghosts. War had rolled past, leaving only silence and unmarked graves. One of those graves held a man no one dared name, a supposed German officer with fine boots, clean hands, and a gold tooth. The locals buried him quietly and moved on. Only when the Red Army advanced months later did partisans return and whisper, "That was him." The confirmation travelled to Moscow by coded message. Agent Siebert, dead. Mission complete. There was no funeral, no ceremony, no honours. His death was classified, his name erased from official reports. In the world of espionage, disappearance was the final promotion. The NKVD assembled his surviving notes, photographs, and reports. They pieced together the full scope of his work: assassinations, infiltrations, intelligence that had saved thousands of lives. He had uncovered the plan to assassinate Allied leaders in Tehran, revealed German troop redeployments, and dismantled the Nazi administration from within. His reports were now history itself, but his identity remained locked under layers of secrecy. For years after the war, even his family did not know how he had died. Letters from the front simply stopped coming. His mother waited, convinced he would walk through the door one day, smiling and quiet as always. Only in 1948, after the archives were reviewed and his case declassified, did the Soviet government officially name him a hero of the Soviet Union. The medal was awarded posthumously. The citation was short: for exceptional courage and heroism in enemy territory. It said nothing about the man who had lived as someone else for nearly 3 years, who had spoken like his enemies, and died among them. In western Ukraine, the partisans who had fought beside him built a small wooden cross at the site of the firefight near Borodin. The inscription read simply, "To the one who spoke like them, but fought for us." For a long time it was the only monument he had. During the 1950s, his story began to surface, slowly, cautiously, shaped by propaganda and pride. Soviet newspapers called him the Invisible Avenger. Films and novels portrayed him as a flawless hero who single-handedly terrorized the German occupation. But the real Kuznetsov was more complicated, a man who lived between languages, who served his country by erasing his own identity. Former partisans remembered him differently. He was calm, one said, too calm, like a man who already knew how his story would end. Others spoke of his solitude, his detachment, the way he kept his distance even among friends. He was always listening, another recalled, even when you thought he wasn't. The NKVD files, unsealed decades later, revealed something deeper. In his final months he had requested permission to abandon the Siebert persona, to return home after his mission. The request was denied. The line in his file reads, "Agent remains operational until termination of objective." Termination came sooner than anyone expected. After the war, his legend grew larger than the man himself. Streets and schools were named after him, statues erected, medals awarded to his surviving comrades. Yet the real Kuznetsov was never found. His bones, buried and lost beneath forest soil, became part of a mythology the state would cultivate for decades. The perfect Soviet spy, invisible, unstoppable, loyal beyond death. But the truth was quieter. He was a linguist, a mimic, a man who turned words into weapons and trust into camouflage. His brilliance came not from ideology, but from precision, from the cold discipline of knowing when to speak and when to disappear. In secret circles of Soviet intelligence, his story was told as a warning, not a myth. A good agent can deceive anyone, one instructor would tell recruits, except himself. Nikolai Kuznetsov had fooled the Gestapo, the Wehrmacht, and the Reichsbureaucracy. But in the end, he had fooled time itself. He existed everywhere and nowhere, a man who lived without leaving fingerprints. He entered the war as a linguist and left it as a shadow, a whisper in two languages, carried by the wind through the forests where he fell. He became the face of perfect disguise, in a world that still struggles to tell truth from lies. Decades after the war, Nikolai Kuznetsov's name still carried the gravity of myth. To many he was not a man, but a symbol, the invisible hand of justice that had struck the Nazi hierarchy from within. Streets in Moscow, Kiev, and Perm bore his name. Statues rose across the Soviet Union, a tall man in a German coat, head slightly bowed, eyes fixed on some invisible horizon. But behind the granite and glory, the real Kuznetsov remained unknowable, a shadow inside his own legend. In the early Cold War years, his story was reshaped to fit a new narrative. School children learned that Kuznetsov was the perfect Soviet patriot, fearless, disciplined, unwavering. Films portrayed him as calm under fire, loyal to the party above all. His missions were dramatized as pure triumph, his inner conflicts erased. The man who had lived between two worlds became a tool for one. Yet even within the silence of official storytelling, traces of the real person survived. Intelligence officers who studied his methods recognized something profoundly human, not propaganda, but precision. They pored over his linguistic analyses, his coded reports, his behavioral notes on German officers. His legacy was not just courage, it was craft. He had mastered the smallest details, the weight of a salute, the rhythm of a dialect, the pause before answering a question. Future generations of spies learned from him that survival was not strength but control. At the Academy of Foreign Intelligence, instructors still mention his name in quiet tones. They speak of his discipline, his patience, his understanding that the enemy's greatest weakness was confidence. He didn't play the role, one training manual reads. He became the role. To young operatives, Kuznetsov remains the impossible standard, the man who lived a lie so flawlessly that truth itself could not keep up. But outside the walls of secrecy, historians began to look again. In the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, archives opened. Files once sealed under top secret revealed the full complexity of his life. The man behind the myth was not the infallible agent of legend, but something more fragile, brilliant, obsessive, and haunted. His own notes showed flashes of doubt. When you live as two people long enough, you forget which one is real. That sentence changed how many viewed him. He was no longer just a spy or assassin. He was a study in identity, a man lost between languages and loyalties. Western historians compared him to Richard Sorge and the British double agents of MI6, but there was a difference. Kuznetsov had no embassy walls, no escape routes, no allies in power. His entire world was built on deception and faith in a cause that never promised him return. Today, his name still surfaces in debates over loyalty and morality and espionage. Was he a hero, fanatic, or simply a man doing his duty with terrifying precision? The question remains unanswered. His story continues to inspire films, novels, and documentaries, yet the deeper truth lies not in heroism, but in the silence he left behind. In 1959, a memorial was built at the site of his last battle in Borodin. Visitors describe it as eerily quiet, a simple stone amid birch trees with an inscription that reads, "To the one who lived among enemies and died for the living." No rank, no decorations, just words carved into stone. If you stand there in the evening, you can still hear the wind move through the trees, carrying fragments of sound, the whisper of two languages blending into one. Somewhere in that echo lies the essence of his life, a man who made speech itself his disguise, who turned trust into a weapon, and who disappeared the moment his task was done. His story endures because it holds a mirror to the modern world. In every age of misinformation, there are men like him, those who navigate lies not to escape truth, but to serve it. He hunted his enemies with words, built his legend out of silence, and left behind the greatest disguise of all, history itself.